3 here in the London Room. It feels odd for me to say it in Spanish or French. So our topic for this next hour is electrifying mobility on the road to zero-emission transportation. We've actually got 2 keynotes to kick off and then into our panel. So first I would like to welcome Dr. Young-Tae Kim. He's Secretary General of the International Transport Forum, who's going to set the scene for us. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, todo el mundo. One of the greatest challenges is to say a lot of good things within 5 minutes, so I go for that with my exact watch, made in Korea. Yeah. And I'm very happy to be here today, and I think most of you know already a little bit of ITF, International Transport Forum, and we are an intergovernmental body composed of 60 member countries. So we are focusing on the transport-related things, but now we are trying to combine transport with other sectors like environment and trade and even tourism and stuff. So first of all, I think I would ask one fundamental question. Is the transport sector important when we talk about reduction of CO2 emissions? If you agree, we can start the discussion from that point of view, because nowadays transport sector is responsible for 25% of the all CO2 emissions in the world. So if we believe that this is really important for us to know, then we have a good reason to talk about transport. And especially according to the study of ITF, we think that between 2015 and 2050, still the CO2 emission will increase by 60% if we do not do anything right now. So what can we do? Maybe you have some ideas because you're an expert in your field, but from our government point of view, international community point of view, we usually think about 2 options. So in the government, people talk about technological development. It includes also electrification. And at the same time, we try to change the behaviors of the passengers and customers by certain measures that government can use, which is not really easy because we have to convince people that they have to change their behavior and attitude and perception, whatever. But in these democratic, liberalized countries, everyone has their own logic and their own thinking, so they have to feel comfortable with that. But otherwise, it's not easy. So that's why we need to also focus on the incentive system, because it's easy to talk about regulations, and maybe private sector feel very uncomfortable when we talk about regulations. But a lot of countries, they easily talk about regulations, but at the same time, as a citizen, I think we also have to think about incentives, how we can really find some benefits in changing our attitudes. And if we focus on the question of electrification, there must be good things and bad things. Not bad things, but uncertain things, I would say. The good things, maybe from a societal point of view, we can reduce CO2s and even particulate matters. And also from an individual point of view, we can save some money. Since I bought a hybrid car, I'm driving a hybrid car since 2017, I feel that I save money. So that's good. That's good. But I think also as a citizen, we can feel proud of contributing to the society as well. But the challenge, we have to think about that. Several challenges. In the government, during the past few days, I participated in several events of COP25. And I stressed all the time that we should have a very smooth governance system in every country. Because I also worked in the government of Korea, in the Ministry of Transportation for more than 20 years, 25 years. And always the challenge was to coordinating the task and the roles inside the government. So for example, at the COP table, we don't have transport ministry participating, the Ministry of Environment participate. And after that, they come back and they allocate the task to different ministries. And suddenly, some ministries understand well, but some ministries, they have feel a lot of pressures. They are not willing to do something. They are forced to do something that makes a great difference. And also, we need to think about the connectivity with other sectors, between transport and other sectors, because a very easy case that everybody might know, the charging station, where the electricity comes from. Maybe it can come from the fuel-based generating system. So basically, it's not easy. We use electric scooters, trottinettes, but sometimes we leave them everywhere, and we have to collect them. And who collect? A lot of bus and trucks come, and if they use diesel and if they use gasoline, basically, superficially, we understand that we are experiencing change, but behind the scene, we might find something different. So also, we are expecting good things when you talk about innovation, but we suffer from uncertainty because disruption means uncertainty. You are disrupted, disconnected. We know what's going to happen tomorrow, but we are happily expecting something good, but it's not always the good case. And if we look at the current situation about the electric cars, and passenger vehicles were responsible for about 27% of global oil demand in 2016. And globally, the total electric light-duty vehicle stock was around 5 million vehicles in 2018. And sales of such electric vehicles amounted to around 2 million units in the same year. And the year-to-year growth of electric vehicle sales is currently in the range of around 60%. However, electric vehicles still only make up 2.5% of the global passenger light-duty vehicle sales. So maybe it's a starting point right now, and we have to prepare for the future. And what can we do in the future? So as a conclusion, I'll briefly mention several things. And we need a holistic approach, as you all agree, I think. But how can be the question? And I know that COP is a really good platform for dealing with different aspects of environment. So until last year, the transport community was kind of isolated a little bit. But from this year, we became officially a part of the COP, the community. So our program was included in COP. The step-by-step transport people gather at the same place to discuss a lot of issues together, which is really good point, and it will continue. And also ITF as a platform for the global transport community, try to reach out to other sectors like energy and tourism and other trade and etc. So we are currently a focal point of UNFCCC and actively participating in Marrakesh partnership as well. So based on my experience of participating in this COP in Madrid, I think a transport community is growing further, and hopefully next year and in the following year, we might voice our opinion more strongly to contribute and to discuss with other sectors. So finally, I will mention one thing. And next year, every year in May, we have a ministers meeting, ministers summit in Leipzig. So next year, from 27th to 29th of May, we will have a ministers meeting in Leipzig discussing the innovation for sustainable development in the transport sector. So cordially, you are invited, and in the interest of time, I feel some laser beam from the Master of Ceremonies. So that was what I prepared very shortly, briefly today, but I wanted to deliver some core messages, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry, we have to keep things moving, but thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Moving on now to our second keynote, Mr. Ralf Pfitzner. He's Head of Sustainability for the Volkswagen Group.
Yeah, thank you. And in the interest of time, I'm just taking a jump start. We heard about the question from Dr. Kim right now. So what's going to happen in the future? And also I heard the words of holistic approach which is needed. And so let me quickly jump into The reason why we are here, and you mentioned the carbon footprint of the transport sector, so I can basically skip this. The transport sector is part of the problem, but we believe also part of the solution in the future. And so far, we have been somewhat been the victim of our own success in terms of globalization, increasing demand of transported goods, ever increasing need for mobility and so forth. And you can imagine, while speaking here for Volkswagen, we are currently one of the largest automakers in the world, that we also have a significant chunk in these global emissions. So if you would account all life cycle emissions, it's really true that our passenger car portfolio accounts for roughly 1% of global emissions. So we are aware of this, and I'm going to talk about, in the next 10 minutes, how we are tackling this. And one thing, setting the scene, I mean, we have the societal, the general political developments. We also have an end consumer responsibility, which is a case for all of us to act accordingly. And we as business are in charge of supplying the right solution and also responding to the political demands as well. So a year ago, pretty close, 370 days ago, one of our senior managers already announced that Volkswagen is going to become carbon neutral by the year 2050 with its entire portfolio. And that's probably the first car maker who made that announcement. So what we've done in the last year, following that approach 2050, which is excellent from my perspective, but since all acting people will be retired by then, it's our work also in the sustainability team and across the company to make it tangible and set the intermediate pathway, because we all know here in this room, it's also about a carbon budget, which is still available by 2050 in order to decarbonize the economy in total. So what we've done is setting out a target across the entire life cycle of our passenger car portfolio to reduce CO2 emissions by 30%. And I'm going to explain in a moment how this is going to work. The vision is really, as you see on the bottom left, since Volkswagen was, let's say, inventing the Beetle a long time ago, creating individual mobility for millions of people, then having the Golf, which even led to that saying of the generation Golf for a complete generation in society, we now envisage the e-mobility as the next cycle or next way, really providing individual mobility for all, because this is what we can do, providing mass mobility for many people, not only for the rich ones. So saying is e-mobility for millions, but not only for millionaires. So that's the challenge we have ahead. And right now I'm talking mainly about passenger car portfolio. We are pretty clear that also truck, heavy-duty vehicles is a topic. It's also no misunderstanding to say that we need more public transport and we need to have seamless mobility, but in this decarbonization approach, I'd really like to focus on that what can be done and has to be done on the, let's say, car mobility side. So the big challenge is, if we want to end up in 2050 with zero emissions, having the life cycle of a car in mind, which typically lasts 10 years or plus, this basically means that we have to stop selling ICE, internal combustion engine cars, by 2040, or having the remaining ones powered with renewable-based fuels. Otherwise, it won't work. Having that in mind, that also a couple of generations are built on a platform, we are somewhere in the 2020s where the last platform for an internal combustion engine is going to be launched. And then there will be the phase-out step by step. And this is not only a nice PowerPoint, but there's two numbers below that signify the importance for us in terms of strategy and also in terms of investments. So Volkswagen is going to launch 75 new pure electric car models by 2028. We haven't been an early starter in the mass market, that's true, but now there's really momentum behind it. Second one is that we just increased the allocated investment numbers up to 33 billion in the next 5 years into electric mobility. So that's a real massive change, and I can also admit somehow Volkswagen learned the need to change the hardware in terms of the diesel crisis and the fines to be paid. But I think we really got the message, and this is right now also even pushing us at the forefront of electrification of transport. And since often the question arises, well, what about hydrogen? What about power to X? What about all the other fuels? There's one key message I want to make you remind of it. When we're talking decarbonization of individual mobility in the passenger car sector, we believe the most important thing is battery electric vehicles. And on this slide, you see the reason why. As long as we don't have infinite surplus renewable energy available, and we have been talking this morning about the energy transition and the massive upscaling demand. As long as we don't have this, we have to be mindful about the total energy efficiency in the value chain. And comparing, for example, fuel cell electric vehicles, e-gas and other ones, you see that battery electric vehicles, due to the system's efficiency, are the most efficient means of transport. So that's why we believe this is the way to decarbonize individual mobility if you want to have a car. Because hydrogen also will only be a solution if it's renewable-based hydrogen. If it's coming from fossil fuels, you can decarbonize transport. So one important aspect to decarbonize and make our job is really electrifying the portfolio. But, and this is again coming back to the holistic approach Dr. Kim mentioned, it's not sufficient. So we have to tackle, and this is what we are right now doing, the entire value chain, coming really at the beginning of the supply chain, working with our suppliers and our sub-suppliers, because this accounts roughly over the life cycle for 1/7 of the vehicle's life cycle. Only 2% is manufacturing in our own operations. So that's what's happening in the Volkswagen plants. Then we have the upstream emissions currently from fuel supply chain, and 2/3 in the current portfolio is basically tailpipe emissions. So we have to control the entire life cycle, and also our target applies to all of these life cycle stages. So how are we going to tackle this? And here's only a few examples, and in the interest of time, I won't go into details. But right now, we're working with battery cell suppliers in bringing them to use green energy, green electricity to use the battery cells for our electric vehicles. We have launched a carbon fund into our own manufacturing operations, 50 million euros a year, financing economically viable and also ecologically beneficial measures in terms of driving energy efficiency. We are also starting to offer green electricity contracts for our customers in the use phase, because this is important if you really have that life cycle in mind. And for us, it's always important, first reduce emissions, then move to renewables, and then we also have a certain chunk where we are working on compensation by reforestation and forest protection measures. So apart from the message, okay, if you want to electrify and decarbonize transport, you have to go battery electric. The second message is, from our perspective, it's really a systems change, and this is massive. So we really have to watch the entire ecosystem. It's about the energy transition, it's about working with suppliers, and also thinking in the context of a mobility ecosystem, bringing in new mobility solutions, ride-sharing services, car sharing, and so forth. And also following the McKinsey presentation this morning, yes, carbon sinks, stopping deforestation is another issue which we're working on as well. And instead of a summary, here's the example of the ID.3 car, which was just launched earlier this year, which is coming to the dealers mid of next year. This is the first showcase where we really tried to nail it down, what can be done in terms of decarbonizing transport. So this is a car which is produced in a plant in Zwickau, which is 100% powered by green electricity. This is a zero-emission vehicle. And then on top of that, we compensate the currently unavoidable emissions in the entire value chain by investing in reforestation and forest protection projects. So the car is going to be handed over to the customer as net carbon neutral. And then it's basically up to you and all customers buying that car to take a green energy contract for home charging, for workplace charging, and so forth. And then you're pretty close to CO2 neutral mobility. There will be remaining emissions, but this brings us pretty close, really, to CO2 neutral individual mobility. And with that, I didn't notice you coming too close to me. I'd like to conclude. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward to also joining the panel.
So I feel bad for most people cutting them off early, but not so much for Mr. Pfitzner since he's joining the panel. If we can get Monica Araya, founder and director of Costa Rica Limpia, and she will pull on the rest of them. Thank you.
Hello, it's Sunday and you're here because I assume you are very passionate about electric mobility, and so am I. So we are going to have a panel, and I would like to introduce our members from different countries, from different sectors. Let's see. We have Mark. Just come here and I'll introduce all of you, because otherwise it's going to take a long time, and we want this to be very, very dynamic. We'll tell you in a second what we're going to do. But let's start with Markus Winkler, Group Head of Automotive and Mobility at Capgemini, private sector. We have somebody from beautiful British Columbia, and he is Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Welcome. Good compliment. We have Julia. And Julia has been very busy. I already moderated a panel where she was. So this shows that she's here because she has something to say. Julia is Head of Public Affairs and Sustainability at Danfoss. And to my right, two people from Germany, which is probably not a coincidence. You know, we're talking about electric mobility, and I'm sure we are going to hear different perspectives, even though you're from the same country. So to my right, we have David Radermacher. We can try how you pronounce my name. It's an international crowd. He's Vice President of Sustainability and Climate at E.ON, so pretty iconic companies from Germany. And this is what we are going to do. We are going to have a conversation, and as you know, we could be here for 24 hours talking about what it takes to transform a transportation sector. So of course we're not going to be able to go into details, so they will have a few minutes. In the first part of the conversation, we are going to talk about right now what works, what doesn't. And of course, because it's in the context of climate and climate negotiations, we also have to talk about the future, the next 5 years, the next decade. What are you doing? And we are going to hopefully give you a chance to ask questions. So if you want to ask a question, then it will be very helpful if you start thinking about it, and then if it's very concrete, then perhaps we can take one of two, because they are very keen to hear from you. And before we get started, I want to ask you a question. How many of you here drive electric? Great. Okay. I drive electric. I have done so in about 13 countries in different continents, and I drive electric in Costa Rica since 2017, and all the electricity in my country is renewable, and we have a decarbonization plan, and we want to be the first country to go fossil-free. So I come from the perspective of a consumer, and it's not very often that I sit with somebody from an auto industry, so this is a great opportunity. Consumers and companies have to talk about.
And the utility is between the two of us.
Yes. Good point, good point. Let's start with Markus. So you work you don't work with cars, but you work in the sector, and you are from a technology company. what is working today? What is not working? Give us a sense of how you see it.
Yes, I mean, we are consultants and we are as well, let's say, a large technology provider. We are working together also with E.ON, but also with Volkswagen and the big giants. What works, what doesn't? I think we got a very good introduction from Dr. Kim saying that e-mobility is actually the way to go, and it's the only chance as well to change. So I think what we don't want to end up with is we will soon have a lot of products, electric cars on the market, but also the market has to be ready. And we can easily end up in a situation that the cars are there, but the market is not ready. So we really need to incentivize the consumers. We need to educate the consumers about how they should use mobility. And that means, of course, usage of electric cars, but it means also how they should share, for example, cars, how sharing offerings should be, and this is one of the answers, should be extended more towards outside of the city, because this is key. At the moment, car sharing is still in a good solution for in the city, but when it goes outside, then it's lacking. And everything that is actually appealing to the consumer works, like, let's say, tax reductions, for example, like very positive messages about, let's say, parking priority, lane access. Those are things where consumer is actually also changing. I mean, from all our transformation projects, whether it's business or IT, there's one common theme. We need a clear communicated vision, the zero-emission vision, actually, that we hear. But we also need a very positive story. So people, the majority of people, will only change if we turn a very aggressive climate debate as well into a very progressive and a nice story for the consumer. I think that's my key point.
I agree, because in Costa Rica, that's what we're doing. As consumers, we created an organization of users, and we are creating the concept of user-to-user festival. So instead of having a person from the car company selling the car, it is the consumers selling it based on the experience they had. So good point. And you see it as a person that is doing consulting for the industry, but let's look at how you engage with electric mobility from the perspective of a government, from the perspective of public policy, and share with us something from British Columbia. I would love to do electric rides there. It sounds like a great place to do this.
Sure, thank you. We situated our government policies in British Columbia for zero-emission vehicles as part of our overall legislated emission reduction targets on our way to 2050. About a year ago, in fact, it'll be a year ago in 2 days, we released our overall strategy in a number of sectors for achieving our emission reduction targets in 2030, 2040, and 2050. And a big part of that was transportation, and will continue to be transportation. It's about 40% of our emissions profile in British Columbia. So we legislated zero-emission vehicle, new light-duty vehicle sales targets to be 100% zero-emission by 2040. I'm personally confident we'll achieve it far earlier than that. We had interim mile posts along the way, and we, in the last year, let me back up a minute. We brought in the legislation. We brought in some new incentives to rebates to help consumers purchase vehicles. We invested a lot of money in significant increases in the charging infrastructure in our province. And just to give you an idea, our province is quite large, with most of the population centered in the southwest corner. So in other parts of the province, there are significant differences or distances, and if people want to drive electric, they need to feel confident that they won't be stuck somewhere in the middle of the highway. So we're putting charging infrastructure everywhere, including quick charge, direct current stations. So we had a combination of people knowing that we had an intent to reach 100% clean energy vehicles by a certain date. We had rebates available. We had increased charging infrastructure, as well as subsidies for home charging infrastructure, workplace charging infrastructure, and multi-unit residential building charging infrastructure. And then coupled with that was a rapidly increasing cost of the price of gasoline in the province. So it became, people could see the future, they could see the answers to the infrastructure concerns they had, they could see some financial ability to make the purchase. They had confidence that they wouldn't be alone in making the purchase because it was part of government policy. And as a result, in the last year, we more than doubled the percentage of new car sales, and we've achieved our almost our 2025 target. We're within about 0.5% of it 6 years early.
Great. And how about you, Julia? I heard you say this week that inside your company you are seeing like this person who's pushing for all these initiatives. How do you see this? What is working? What is not working?
Yeah, I like to call myself the chief climate activist within the company, so bear with me. And I would like to ask you a question as well, because this is quite a skewing question already when you ask who's actually driving an electric vehicle. So who's living in a city? Okay. Who owns a car? So we can see that we're still here on the one part of the demographics. And then the third question would be, who does not have a driver's license? Yeah, go ahead. So there's no shame in this. No, this is exactly the narrative that we have to change, because while I'm Bavarian, so also German, and of course the headquarters of BMW, and as long as I remember, my grandfather had a BMW. I think he just bought his 7th or something like that with 79, not an electric vehicle. And I had my first car with 17. But then I actually moved to Denmark. And there, all of a sudden, cars, mobility was a bit different, right? All of a sudden, mobility meant to have a bike, to have the freedom of that, to have no maintenance cost as much as possible, and to have a completely different approach to mobility, because it was a mindset and a cultural shift. And the session is entitled Electrifying Mobility, right? But we, of course, already had started our discussions around cars in the first place. And while we need to electrify, and we're completely with you on this, the question, of course, when we speak about mobility is how do we look at this in a holistic way, because we can't just exchange in the planetary boundaries that we have as well one combustion engine with a battery, because that will not help us to decarbonize or to stay within our carbon budget. And that's ultimately why we're here today, right? So for us, the best place to really talk about electrifying mobility and decarbonizing is the city. Because there, we touched upon, you can actually couple sectors, and you can look at mobility in a way. So if you look at buildings, for instance, if we would retrofit the building sector, and that's a European example, so excuse me, Monica, but if we would increase the rate of retrofits in buildings from 1% to 3%, which is actually our target, we could free up electricity by 2040 for around 550 million electric vehicles. And we need that electricity because we want to have it green and so on, and we heard the numbers. We can't really meet this demand for green electricity, for renewables. So as an example, that's why I'm going into other countries or areas in Europe. Taipei, for instance, they started to electrify their bus lines as a first step, and that's what cities can also do. They can look at electrifying one bus line at a time, while of course having all the preferential treatments that we've heard for electric vehicles as such, and individual mobility. So if I had to make two policy asks, then there would be one for cities to set very high ambition decarbonization targets. 2025, 2029, and then look at the solutions in a holistic way across sectors. with all the different players on board, and not just say, okay, we're going to exchange one car with the other. It's not going to help us, right? And then I'll go into a couple of other ideas later on, Monica. Thanks.
Thank you. So now I have realized I have 3 Germans. I thought it was 2. 4. Okay, so we are minority here. And but I mean it in a different way, because we discussed before that we also have to keep in mind that a lot of the electric mobility discussions are very focused on Europe, China, parts of the US, sometimes Canada, but we don't want to end up with the polluting cars in the emerging economies. So our colleagues will bring that up in the next round. Germany, electricity and auto industry. What's working, what's not working? How do you reach out to consumers and say driving electric is cool with renewable electricity?
Yeah, I like that point. How do we make sure that driving electric is cool? And it almost feels like doing a summary here now of that round already, although we're just in the middle of it. But what Markus said is we need to transform the way we talk about mobility, and we need to enable the coolness of driving electric. Because I like driving electric, but it's about we need to reduce barriers, and that's kind of the role of E.ON as one of the largest distribution system operators in Europe. So we run power grids, and there's a lot of panic around e-mobility in the media as well on will large shares of e-mobility lead to blackouts? So last year we've conducted a stress test of our grid, and we're looking at a very rural, so not city-based distribution grid, Eastern Germany, Northern Germany, parts of Bavaria. Around 10 million people we supply there, and it's 6.5 million registered cars. So we said, let's look at actually a stress test where we analyze how stable our grid is in terms of electrification up to 100%. And so the first result is that the grid is stable because it's an area where we have seen, like in Costa Rica, a lot of renewable energy expansion. So grids, power grids, usually in areas with a high share of renewables are very stable because they have been made fit to actually take high shares of renewable energy. And what we see is that we need to invest in this area around 2.5 billion euros additionally across the next 25 years. So to put this into perspective, that means in an area where we invest around 1 billion per year, that means like an additional 10%. However, this does not take into account digital solutions yet. So if we manage to digitalize and smartify our grid, we can bring this down. So again, that means we do not, so put it on a car. So one time invest per car in an undigital world is 400 euros. That's not that much. And we can bring this down to 180 euros, one time invest into the grid to enable 100% EVs. And I think that's the way we need to talk about it. So the grid is stable in large areas of the world. But of course, this again brings me to another point, because it's a very German discussion already. We need to see that electrification and enabling grid is improving people's life. So if we drive e-mobility and we enable the power infrastructure, this does not only clean transportation, but it also improves people's lives because it's a more stable power supply, and that has influence on the whole life.
Yes, this is happening in many countries, these kind of discussions about grids and utilities. And before we hear again from this iconic auto industry company, I want to make sure that we keep in mind what Julia said about the importance of public transportations and bikes. But because this panel has somebody from such an important company, in terms of the question of what works and what doesn't, I would really like to hear in that context, how do you see behavioral change? What have there been any learnings about consumers and just it's a bigger discussion, but I'm sure that this is part of this conversation about transformation.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's indeed a very good question, since I mentioned we're talking systems change right now, and people are not always willing to change behavior, or sometimes you have to overcome psychological hurdles and really get the motivation to change something because you have been successful in the old behaviors, and it was easy and convenient, and fuel didn't cost that much for individual mobility. So it's really about overcoming certain hurdles, and in order to make that transition work, I mean, one thing is really spread the message: e-mobility is cool and is convenient and is fun. If you want to use a car, and this was also my personal experience, having worked in a different sector until 2 years ago. When trying out my first electric car, that was an amazing experience. It's so quiet. It's also, the acceleration is fast, and it feels good if you power it by green electricity. So it's really about bringing people for the first time into an electric car. This helps a lot, and giving them a try and say, okay, just try it out. You have all those range anxiety concerns and things that don't work and constraints, but give it a try. That's the first important step. And there are already a number of e-models out there. There's also hybrid technology, which somewhat from our perspective is rather bridging technology, because in the long term you're still driving too much on fossil fuels, but it helps people to experience it, or at least to locally drive in a city emission-free. So that's I think one part. And the other thing is, I believe we also have to have a very open and sometimes controversial debate on what's out there on the table. And there's so many, let's say, protests. If we're thinking about carbon pricing, people are anxious about yellow vests if we increase the fuel prices. And I think this brings us again to the question, well, on the one hand, how to design those political frameworks in a sound manner that people don't feel I'm, well, only taking away something, but they're giving something back: cleaner air, future-proof infrastructure, and also innovations in an industry which is, in terms of workplaces, quite important for Europe. So we have to have that debate, and also bring into the forefront that climate change affects us all. And we had a side discussion on drafts in Germany in another session. So we experience the negative consequences already today in Europe. And this is, I mean, the developed Western world. Consequences are much more severe in other regions of the world. And to me, it's important to say, at the end, if we don't act fast enough and change behavior, it will come at our own cost and at the cost of our kids. And I think making that emotional connection also to what's out there will help us also in the automotive industry to transform and to speed up the transition.
Yes, and I can relate to that also, because one thing we learned in Costa Rica is that many women said, I never engaged in the decision of what car we would buy as a family. But if it's electric, I want to be involved because it's zero emissions, because it uses our own electricity as opposed to imported oil. And because of culture, I noticed that I would go to places like this, and I would say, no, but the electric car goes uphill. And some gentleman would stand up and say, I just don't believe you, because you don't know about cars. I know about cars. So I found myself recording a video going up to a volcano, to showing that you could get there, and then showing that it would charge as you went down. And the cameraman was very shocked himself. And then women wrote back saying, wow, this is so helpful, because then I can ask you questions, because they didn't feel like asking the question to the person who repaired the car, or to even to their husband. So there is this other element there, which is women engaging. So let's start moving to the next 5 years. What do you see in the next 5 years happening? Infrastructure, behavior, you can choose the angle.
I mean, that's a very wide question, because, I mean, the world is very diverse, as we know. So I think what we definitely see is we will go into a very high adoption rate of battery electric vehicles, especially in the cities. But even there, it will be dependent on what the city will allow. Let's take an example. If now also some of the cities are banning EVs from the inner cities, that might also be a little bit a drawback on the adoption rate. So it's a very, very complex relationship. And at the end of the day, I think we should be aware to give all the alternatives that the automotive industry and the mobility sector needs to give all the alternatives, meaning actually, yes, e-mobility, because now it's, as of today, the only chance to decarbonize fast, but at the same time opening up car sharing, at the same time looking also for different technologies as well, like hydrogen, for example, because there are still some use cases where currently electromobility doesn't reach it, not so much in the personal vehicle segment, but when it comes, for example, to the transportation of goods, heavy trucks, this will be still out there, and there's also solutions in place. I mean, just to mention a few, I mean, when we work, for example, with Faurecia, supplier, working on a real-time emission platform, which is monitoring more or less the tailpipe. Those kind of data analytics can help us also on this ICT, the internal combustion engines, when we work with Audi and intelligent charging. This is actually something, where the car itself gives something back to the grid and enables the stability of the grid. So those are the solutions actually that we need as well. And we all have to do this stuff in parallel. And that's actually the real challenge.
How do you see it from British Columbia?
Well, I'm going to take 5 years, but also stretch the horizon a little bit. I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see prices drop. We're going to see battery technologies improve significantly, and I think we're also going to see information technology that can help vehicles be integrated into the grid. But in a longer term, I want to acknowledge what Julia said, because it's not just about individual vehicles. So as a government, we're investing in electrifying both the provincial and the municipal bus fleets in our largest city. We have a large island with a significant amount of British Columbia's population is off the coast, off the west coast of British Columbia, so you get there either by ferry or by plane. So electrification of those ferries is going to be important. Some of the smaller routes are already electrifying. We have a small seaplane company that is about to pilot, I think this week, its first flight of a fully electric plane, and has announced it wants its entire fleet electrified in about 10 years. I think we as a government need to work with the trucking industry, because people make long-term investments in heavy-duty trucks, 20 years. We need to help move them to more energy efficient and hopefully zero-emission trucking. And the same with marine transport. There's a lot of work to be done there. So these are all across the spectrum. I think we, while somebody raised earlier, I think you did, who has no driver's license. In many parts of the world, people either don't drive or it's not desirable to drive, so we need affordable public transportation. Ideally, I think if we can make the cost of it zero or close to zero, more people will take it, people will move more efficiently, and it'll benefit all of us.
Yes, if we had been in Santiago, we probably would have seen the amazing fleet of electric buses they have. I don't know if there is anybody from Santiago, but it's a very positive story. Julia, what do you see in the next 5 years, the next decade?
I think it's, again, the city's acting, because I lived in Santiago actually a while, and in addition to the traffic jams with more and more people going for individual mobility, in exactly these in Latin America, if we go outside of Europe, right? Plus then air pollution. And I think we had a short discussion earlier. I mean, it's a climate part which we have to act on, and there we have a time frame. So until 2030, 45% of emissions reductions needed to stay within the 1.5 degrees pathway. But at the same time, there's also air pollution and people really suffering and dying from that in cities, right? So we have to do something here very specifically. So we will see more mayors setting their targets, but also delivering on them. And that's the key, right? We are really moving into the decade of action, into starting to implement and moving from this talk to action. So we will have to see that these national targets and also the city targets actually are aligned with policy. I think that's key to look into what has worked maybe in other transitions and so on. We see, and I'm taking again the example of Denmark, because you would think, well, they've solved that whole EV thing long time ago and they have the right policy in place. But even there, it's actually, if you're a company with company cars, it's more expensive to give your employees an electric vehicle. It's totally, really, I mean, it's ridiculous, right? If you think about it, especially since the Prime Minister came out, I think it was last year, to say, well, by 2030 we want to have 1 million electric vehicles. And then you look at the policy and you realize that it's completely misaligned with what the targets are. And I think that's where we have to look at, and also in terms of activists or NGO sector, giving them the tools to say, well, now we are on the streets, we have the platform, but what are we asking for? There are very concrete steps that we have to do. And it worked already in Denmark, because the new social democratic government that just came into power here in June, in addition to setting a 70% reduction target by 2030, they say, okay, we need to adjust this policy. They came out with a climate law and the financial framework for that as well. So from January 1st, it's going to be cheaper for companies to give these electric vehicles as company cars. So it's working, it's moving, but we really have to move into implementation mode now.
Well, we have disruptions and surprises and things that we never imagined were possible, but we can also say a few things, I suppose, from the utility perspective on what you see in the crystal ball in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I would like to pick up Julia's point about action in cities. So, of course, we see mayors acting and forming agendas, but what we see as a provider of energy solutions is that especially other societal actors like real estate developers are already acting. So any greenfield development, large investors already today say, okay, we do not want an energy concept, we want an integrated energy and mobility concept. And we do not want an electric mobility concept that only covers the grid perspective and enables for 2,500 people, 2,500 EVs. And we want an integrated mobility concept for cities. So it includes car sharing concepts and e-bikes and the whole range of e-scooters, etc. So we already see that infrastructure-wise in cities, a lot of investors are ahead of the discussion, because they are taking investments for periods of 20, 30, 40 years, and they are already anticipating today in greenfield developments especially. And at the same time, I think we see the pressure from the societal movement of the next generation in two ways. So the one is that that is mentioned that many teenagers will not have driver's license anymore. And at the same time, they are at an age where they put pressure on their parents in the next decision for the next car. Is it an EV or is it combustion? So I think these are developments that will actually lead to an incremental development, because they are multiplying each other. So we're setting the scene infrastructure-wise in cities, but also in the countryside. And at the same time, it's about the individual decision.
Yes, we're seeing that in Costa Rica. Teenagers coming to our festival saying, my dad is going to buy a car, but he doesn't believe in electric cars, so that's why I brought him. So it is happening. So we don't have a lot of time, and you're last. And what do you want to think about in terms of the future?
Well,
in the next 5 years or 10?
By 2025, so the brief answer is that we believe electric mobility and battery electric mobility in terms of total cost of ownership will be more attractive for customers than ICE-powered mobility, with a cost out of batteries, and also increasing regulations for the conventional vehicles. So cost parity will be achieved at latest by then. Sometimes it's already there as of today. Second one is also in terms of numbers, we expect 20 to 25% of the new sales in the Volkswagen group, so be it Audi, Volkswagen, Seat, Skoda and others, to be battery electric vehicles. So this amounts to roughly 2 million cars in 2025. Third, I believe the main infrastructure challenges have definitely been solved by then. Much earlier, we're also heavily investing in fast charging infrastructure along the motorways together with other car manufacturers, because this is the prerequisite to make it happen. So this is done by then. And I would expect also to see many more, let's say, mobility as a service, seamless mobility, car sharing initiatives popping up. Although, and I also, well, I'm sad, I have to say this, there is no silver bullet in terms of replacing the car by XYZ, car sharing, whatever. If you dig deeper, the question always is, well, is that new solution cannibalizing public transport, or is it replacing individual car rides? And so there we have to put a lot of intelligence in that we don't get rebound effects we want to see.
Great, thank you. And I think this is all we have time for. But let's just keep in mind that there are very negative news out there. But I think in terms of electric mobility is one of the sectors where we are really seeing very positive dynamics, a lot of opportunities and space for change. So thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you to you because you're here on a Sunday. Thank you.
And I think all of us are happy to take your questions. Since we didn't have time for questions now, just in the next break or during the networking, happy to be here for discussion.
Good idea. We stay here.
And the questions aren't now, they're in an hour. So thanks very much to the panel. And as they leave and then the next one prepares itself, we're going from a sector focus to a regional focus. So yeah, if you could keep your questions till the coffee break, please. I know even though they're here, they promise to stay. So the next one is the next generation of finance in LATAM. Sustainability is a driver to tapping new markets. It's a co-hosted event with the IDB Invest. And it's easier for me because I'm inviting both the keynote and the moderator, Elin Mirovic, to the stage. She's head of climate change at IDB Invest. And as I say, if the networking card stuff could just hold on for one more hour, that'd be awesome. Thank you. Is Elin here?
Well, now we have a transition of the panel. So I'm just going to invite our panelists, Remco, Divya, Mark, and Rufin, to come and join me. The structure of this hour to talk about ESG integration, basically it's going to be divided in two parts. One part that I'm just very small, very quickly talk to you about what's happening in Latin America regarding sustainable investing and ESG integration, just to give an overview of why is it important to learn from other sessions or other regions. And that's why we call this wonderful panel here, to learn from what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the world, what's happening in the US in terms of ESG integration. So let me start with this presentation, just the clicker. Yeah. So just to give you an example of what's happening in Latin America regarding sustainable investing, let me just tell you about sustainable investing in general. We have a market of $30 trillion, and initially we know that sustainability was kind of a on-the-side type of issue that was included in sustainability report, where risk or financial risk was considered secondary. We have seen an evolution where reports are, and not necessarily a sustainability report, but actually a positive report or a financial report of a company. It starts including risk, and TCFD had a lot to do with that. And now investors more and more are asking for information on financial performance, what's uniform and comparable, and that can be audited. And of course, all the trends in the EU are showcasing where we could reach or where we could get as a region in sustainable investing. But just to showcase how important it is for Latin America to start including impact investing and ESG integration plus climate into the selection of investments, it's important to know what could happen in a 4-degree scenario. And this is just a picture that was created by National Geographic in trying to show what would happen in a 4-degree world or a 5-degree world where most of the ice was melted. And as you can see, especially in Latin America, where you have many coastal cities, many of the coastal cities, for example, Buenos Aires, where I'm from in Argentina, would be flooded. This means also a lot of water in the Amazon that would provide less fresh water. The World Bank calculated that there would be 17 million climate migrants in the region. The agriculture yields would reduce between 7 to 10%. So it is actually a priority for the region to start including climate considerations and ESG integration in their investments. Now, is it mainstream? Is ESG integration mainstream in the region? Well, we see an increased interest of sustainable investing in practices in the region, but it's still quite low. We're still under, in the 14, 19%, but there are not high numbers in terms of interest of integrating climate change and ESG into business or investment decisions. However, we have seen at IDB Invest many banks that are coming to us and trying to support them in developing green protocols or sustainability roundtables that will help them raise the bar to start thinking about integrating sustainability in their decisions. And these are the green protocols or sustainability roundtables that are in the region right now. Some of them we supported, some of them started by their own. And many of them, they started because there was a G from the ESG, a G problem or an environmental problem that had impact in the reputation of banks. For example, the Mesa de Finanzas Sostenibles in Paraguay, it was a result of a lot of deforestation that started impacting the banks. Or Honduras, they started talking to us that they needed to create this roundtable because they were investing in hydropower plants and there were social issues with the power plants. So there were many times real issues that brought all the banks together to start developing sustainability standards or trying to understand how they could integrate ESG into their decision. And now the next step or the frontier is ESG plus climate into their investment. So with that frame, I'm just going to move back, and I guess they'll move back to the panel. With that frame in mind, we thought of bringing together this awesome panel. Thank you all for joining us. We have Remco from UNEP-FI that he can tell us a little bit about what's happening at the international level, what organizations like UNEP-FI or PRI are trying to do with advocacy in terms of ESG integrations and climate, and he will talk a little bit more about that. Then we have Divya and Rufin, an asset owner, an asset manager that can tell us a little bit about what's, when we talk about all this capital that is out there that can be tilted or invested in sustainability, they have experiences on how to do it. And then we have a bank, an important bank that has done many initiatives on ESG integration. They have clients direct clients that are investing sustainably. And so I wanted to basically get a sense from them of what are the challenges and what are the opportunities and what can be maybe takeaways for the region. So let me start with Remco talking a little bit about UNEP-FI work on specifically how to start this process. TCFD is something that you have been very highly involved. Maybe there are lessons there of that work?
Yes, thank you, Helen. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. My name is, just by way of introduction, and then I'll start going into those points. My name is Remco Fischer. I am the climate change lead at UNEP Finance Initiative. We're a network of 300 financial institutions run by the United Nations Environment Program that covers commercial banks, largely, but also insurance companies and asset managers. And ultimately, we're there. The ultimate objective is quite intuitive. We want to green the finance sector. And what that means is we want to put the finance sector in a situation where it can use the tools that it has, and that is largely engaging with clients, engaging with portfolio companies, engaging with policymakers, using the political leverage that they have, but also using cost of capital dynamics, financing dynamics perhaps, to incentivize certain behaviors in the economy. But ultimately, greening the finance sector is a means to greening the real economy. I cover climate change, so to me, greening the economy means making the economy low carbon and also making it resilient to the physical impacts of climate change. And what I wanted to do today is just, very much from this global perspective. I'm half Peruvian, but I left the region many years ago, and I don't cover it professionally. But to give a sense of what's our sense of this notion of integrating ESG issues into the finance sector, what's the evolution that we're seeing that started perhaps 2 decades ago or so? What's the past, what's the present, what's the future? So, we've always framed these things risk and opportunity, materiality. What's the mantra? We need to frame these things. If we're talking to financial institutions, we need to translate them into risks and opportunities. And if FIs become savvy and sophisticated in managing risks and opportunities, that will green them. And also, we focused heavily on disclosure, transparency, reporting by financial institutions on the risks and opportunities, assuming that, even if they remain voluntary, those disclosures will facilitate some kind of race to the top, competitive dynamic between FIs to be the best, the most sophisticated, the savviest when it comes to these risks and opportunities, and with the hope that that would also ultimately green them, as I said at the beginning. Now, fast forward 2017, we've got the TCFD recommendations coming out, making a big impact in this space, and for very good reasons. All of this was music to our ears at UNEP-FI. You had this new framework. It came with a lot of political clout. It had the FSB backing. It had been mandated by Mark Carney. It had been chaired by Michael Bloomberg. All of the CEOs in our network suddenly knew about climate risk disclosures and wanted to do something about it. And so we thought that was great. Plus, it said, the TCFD framework said, disclosures, financial institutions shall not only be the consumers of disclosures from their portfolio companies and their clients, but they also need to be disclosing themselves, which is precisely the message that we had been advancing. And thirdly, and this is a little bit the transition from the past to the present, the TCFD said, if you want to get climate risk disclosure right and climate risk assessments right, you need to be doing that in a forward-looking way, in a scenario-based way, because there's no way you're going to get your climate risks right if you're looking at today's carbon price or at today's probability of extreme events. You need to be looking into the future, because climate change changes the climate. It changes everything. And so all of this was perfect, but carrying out scenario-based, forward-looking, portfolio-wide risk assessments and opportunity assessments across transitional risks, so carbon risks and physical risks, is complex. It's not easy. I mean, me spelling this out already is complicated. So, and actually doing it is really complicated. And so this is why we created these pilots. You want one for banks. There's 40 banks now collaborating, one for institutional investors with 20 institutional investors, one with 20 insurance companies, all working together to figure out what do the methods and the logics actually look like to do this. And we've been doing this for 2 years. I think the main learnings from all of this work, and then I'll stop, is that, you know, thanks to the TCFD, absolutely this issue of climate change has landed in the consciousness of the CEOs and the CIOs of the companies concerned and the CFOs, and this is where we need it to be. Secondly, it remains complex to be doing this funky thing of scenario-based, you know, working on with the IPCC scenarios and trying to figure out what does that mean for my portfolio in 10 years' time from now. It remains complex, but it's doable. And financial institutions are sophisticated institutions that can figure this out. And if you want to get going on it, you can go to the Unipify website. There is the pilot programs, there's the resources that get you started. Another thing is we need to work more on this interface, and this is another learning, between finance and the science. All of these scenarios, be them from the IEA or be it from the IPCC, in terms of to facilitate this forward-looking approach, have been developed having policymakers and academia in mind, not financial institutions. We need to work on that. And lastly, perhaps, and this is where I start moving from the present to the future, but we'll cover this later in the discussion, we need to appreciate that the TCFD, and I say this very much from a UNA perspective, is not an environmental framework. It's not a climate outcomes framework. It's not a climate stability framework. It's a financial stability framework. It's a risk managerial framework, and that comes with certain pretty fundamental constraints as to what it can deliver. So as Unipify, we're opening up a new, less risk-focused, perhaps more normative from just getting financial institutions to say, you know what, this is not so much, you know, risks and opportunities, of course, we have fiduciary duties to respect, but ultimately we need to make ourselves compatible with 1.5 no matter what. And we need our portfolio companies to become compatible with 1.5 no matter what. And so it becomes a little bit more of a normative stance. That's the future, and I'll leave it to later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Remco. So maybe we can follow with the issues that Remco was mentioning about engagement, ESG integration, advocacy. Those are three of the main things you at CalPERS are doing. And maybe you can tell us about how did you initiate this journey? Sure. What did it take? What are the lessons there?
Sure. So, hi everyone. I'm Divya, and I'm at CalPERS, which is California's public pension fund for about 2 million public servants who are either currently working for the state of California or retirees. So we have this broad mission to pay their retirement and medical benefits, and we manage nearly $400 billion in assets towards doing that. And at this moment, we're about 70% funded. Our target return is 7%. We pay about $20 billion in payments each year for retirement and medical benefits. And I bring all of that up because despite that challenge that we have, that context in which we operate, we have maintained through market cycles the concept that climate change represents a systemic risk to CalPERS and its ability to meet its commitments. And therefore, for over a decade, we've been advocating in favor of carbon pricing, in favor of companies thinking about climate change as part of their forward-looking strategy, as Remco mentioned, and other activities. And really, after the Paris Agreement, I had the pleasure of being in Paris during that COP. We really thought about, okay, now we've been doing things, you know, in this sort of scattered way for years. How do we really step up to the next level and expand our attention to climate change? And so one of the ways that we're doing that is through integrating, which Remco started to talk about, talking to our managers, talking to our companies about how do you think about climate change in your strategy? Are you thinking about physical climate risk? And for example, if you're a food company, do you think about, will you have enough access to water or extreme heat? How will that you know, affect your output, for example? So that's a very complicated thing to do. Luckily, what we've learned through working with some partners at Woods Hole Research Center who are climate scientists is that actually climate models have been more reliable than financial models. which is quite an interesting insight that we learned. And so, just as Remco said, my challenge is really in coordinating at a landscape level our climate strategy for CalPERS, figuring out how to get science to talk to finance and vice versa. And so, yes, we invest across asset classes in equities, fixed income, private equity, infrastructure, timberland, and trying to think about, okay, the world currently is headed towards a 3.2 degree to 3.6 degree world in terms of government commitments, but we would like it to be tilting more towards a 1.5 degree. So how do you simultaneously advocate with companies, with managers, with governments to create that wave towards 1.5 degrees while simultaneously preparing for what is our current reality, which is a 3.2 to 3.6 degree world. And as you can imagine, it's complicated, but as he said, also doable. So actually later this week, I was hoping I'd be able to say today we released, but I believe it's later this week, we'll be releasing our first climate risk report our first sustainability report that looks exclusively at climate risk and opportunity. That gives you sort of a menu of options for those funds that are considering how can we begin to address climate change in our assets, all of the myriad things that we've started doing. So that includes engaging companies, engaging managers, advocating with governments at the national and the international level in favor of carbon pricing and reducing fossil fuel subsidies. And then really also so much of our work is internal, getting internal portfolio managers to engage with climate scientists. That's been a big project of the last year so that we can start asking better questions of our companies. I'm happy to go more into any of that, but one of the interesting things that we actually learned this year was we had this really awesome fixed income manager who was really taking in the climate science and thinking about, okay, in the companies, in the sector that I handle, what should I be asking them in terms of how they're thinking about physical climate risk? And so this manager engaged a rail company looking at the science that says we're going to experience more days of extreme heat, and that has an impact on rail infrastructure. And sure enough, what he found is that this company is aware of this problem, has increased its monitoring of tracks in order to deal with adaptation to short-term climate risks, as well as preparing for the long term, of course. And yes, they have been replacing tracks, and they have seen an uptick in the need for that kind of oversight. And so the point that I wanted to make in sharing that example is that we learn from our companies. So for funds that are thinking about how do I go about this, who's going to help me figure out how to think about climate change, your companies often know more about it than investors have. And the other thing I wanted to dispel is that climate change is this long-term risk exclusively, and that we aren't already seeing financial impacts in our portfolio. So yes, we're super happy that that rail company is thinking about it so deeply, but that cost is also something that they are dealing with. They have to increase oversight, increase CapEx to replace rail ties. And so I just wanted to dispel the idea that this is exclusively sort of a long-term risk that we have all this time to prepare for. We're already seeing impacts in our portfolio today.
Thank you, Divya. Maybe I'll just move to you, to Rufin, to ask the question about, does it make sense to integrate ESG? And I know DWS has a very extensive study on actually the financials of integrating ESG into investment. It pays. And so maybe, for the people that may be asking if there is a trade-off here, maybe you can highlight a little bit about what you have found.
Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you to IDB for inviting DWS to today's panel discussion. Before I answer your question, a few things about DWS. We are one of the world's largest asset managers. We're headquartered in Germany, and we have 750 billion euros in assets under management across active investments in public markets, equities, fixed income, multi-asset. We're also the second largest provider of passive solutions here in Europe, and we have a very large alternatives asset management business across real assets in real estate, infrastructure, and private equity. ESG is tough, it's difficult, it's complicated. I think if you listen to what Remco and Divya have said already, it's complicated. And anyone who thinks that ESG investing is just ticking a box is completely mistaken. If we look at the components of ESG, the environmental piece, the social piece, and the governance piece, they all act differently, and they're all important into investment processes and into investment decisions. Does it matter? Does it ultimately add to financial returns? Is a key question that we get from investors around the world. We're all fiduciaries as asset managers and asset owners. We all have to meet return targets. We just heard that CalPERS is 75% funded with $20 billion of payments every year. So what does ESG really mean from an alpha generation point of view? So at DWS, we worked with one of our portfolio managers, the head of our multi-asset practice, wanted to go back and do a PhD. He went back to the University of Hamburg and worked with a professor at the University of Hamburg and ultimately wrote an academic study, the two of them combined, in 2015. This academic study you can find on our website, dws.com. And actually this study has been quoted by many organizations, including UNEP-FI, as well as by the chairman of PRI, as the study that proves that ESG investing ultimately improves returns for companies and returns for investors. Now, since we were invited by the IDB and Latin America is one of our focus points today, for emerging markets, and we just issued another paper on emerging markets and ESG investing. The paper from 2015, which we updated in 2018, very clearly showed that the corporate governance factor, so the G in ESG, was really material when it comes to emerging markets companies. In Latin America specifically, we have seen a number of corporate governance failures, and that has had material impact on share prices. So the G in ESG, particularly for a continent like Latin America, is really important. But as your presentation showed, looking at the very significant coastline and looking at temperature increases that we're currently on the path of by the end of the century of 3 degrees plus, Latin America will be very significantly impacted. And I think on climate change, and now bringing it to the E in ESG, we've already heard a number of points on climate change. But what I think all of you need to take away from this panel is that climate change, one, is hard. And if you look at it from an investor point of view, there are risks. There are also opportunities. But on the risk side, there is physical climate risk, which we can all understand when droughts happen, when hurricanes happen, and we've seen these issues in Middle America and in Latin America. But it's also about transition risk. And I want to talk about transition risk for a minute, because this is very complex. So if you think about transition risk, i.e. moving from a high carbon to a low carbon economy, it will impact every country on Earth. It will impact every sector of the economy, and it will impact every company in the world. It doesn't matter what it is you do, you will be impacted by transition risk. So how do you then incorporate that into investments? And is it already being priced in? It was interesting to me, listening to the previous panel on e-mobility. Because if you look at the car industry, it doesn't matter which car company you pick, they're all trading at very low valuations currently. And why recently the Tesla share price has fallen for reasons that have more to do with statements that were made by the company than its underlying business model. But for a long time, Tesla was trading at a premium to established car companies without making much profit, without being able to deliver to their delivery timelines, while the established car companies are cranking out lots of profits, and are also cranking out lots of cars. So why was there that differential in valuation? I would argue the market always looks ahead, it discounts future developments, and it was transition risk that's already being priced in to car companies around the world. Now, I can go through many different sectors of the economy, many different companies, to show you that transition risk is not something that's going to happen in 2030 or 2070. It's happening and being priced in to securities as we speak. So this is very complex. And one of the items that we haven't discussed, although we talked about the TCFD a bit, is how do you measure this? Because ultimately what gets measured gets managed. And so at DWS, for the last 15 years, we've been working with a lot of different data providers in creating an ESG engine which allows us to fully integrate ESG considerations into our investment process and into our investment decisions. But on physical climate risk and transition risk, just to show you how nascent this business is, we only just got our first data on transition risk from data providers this summer, and physical climate risk data really hasn't been out there for more than 2 years. And so this data is still being worked on. This data is not perfect, but at least it starts giving us some data points to take into investment considerations. And back to the TCFD and to data disclosures, in our corporate engagement practice, we ask companies to sign up to the TCFD, to disclose more around these physical and transition risk issues, because ultimately it's that data disclosure that will lead to measurement, that will lead to improvement in investment decisions. So I think I hopefully have answered the question, but also, again, ESG and ESG integration is very complex. It's not a tick-the-box exercise. You're dealing with additional complexity, and that additional complexity is not non-financial. Now, a lot of times people think about ESG as non-financial risks. We argue that a lot of these risks are actually, and to Divya's point as well, are financial risks that we need to understand. And climate modeling, indeed, a lot of times is more spot on than financial modeling is, but the two really have to come together to understand what it is that investors need to look for in generating alpha for their clients.
Thank you. Thank you for integrating also ESG, not only climate. And Mark, to you, my question is, well, it sounds like it's very complex and that it's very hard to do, and we haven't done enough. Can we be hopeful? What's ahead?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, I get more optimistic the older I get, which is maybe not the normal way round. But if you think where we were after Copenhagen in 2009, I think that was really the low point of my following of climate change and sustainability more broadly. And the reason I've become more optimistic is primarily, I think there are three forces that are driving change, and they're working in a virtuous feedback loop that is accelerating and intensifying the three forces together. The first and most important one, I think, is the economics of the energy transition. If you go back 10 years ago to Copenhagen, what was the main reason we failed to get a deal in Copenhagen, but we got one in Paris? What changed in those 6 years between 2009 and 2015? I mean, I think there were two big changes. China's position changed because they started taking the air pollution issue more seriously, and thankfully for the rest of the world, the solution to air pollution is the same as the solution to climate change. But the other big thing that changed was a very rapid reduction in costs of renewable energy. So it became cheaper to mitigate the effects of climate change. And when I say the costs have been falling, I mean, we're talking about spectacular reductions in cost. If you think that solar generation in 2009, the average price globally for solar was around $400 a megawatt hour, and today the average price globally, for solar obviously it varies so much depending on the location that it's a bit misleading to talk about an average global price, but the IEA does produce one anyway, and probably today that would be around 70. But as we all know, and as you can read almost on a weekly basis, there is somewhere in the world developing solar projects below 30, even below 20, certainly on a monthly basis. So we've seen very dramatic change in the economics. Now, for me, and I'll talk about the other two forces I see driving this as well, but I just want to dwell a little bit more on this point, because the flip side to your question, I think, Helen, is what are the obstacles? I mean, and I'll come to that in a moment, but being optimistic, the obstacles I see are not economic obstacles. The biggest obstacle I see is a psychological obstacle. And what I mean by that is that if you think about the difference between, the fundamental economic difference between renewable energy and fossil fuel energy, the energy that has powered the world for the last 250 years, that drove the Industrial Revolution, and that has driven the way we think about the world and the economy and how everything works. Where investors make, let's take the oil industry, it's the largest and most deeply capitalized and by far the most valuable of the fossil fuel industries. The most valuable part of the value chain in the oil and gas industry is the upstream part of the value chain. You know, and when oil and gas companies look to make investments, they're typically targeting a return of 15 to 20% in that part of the value chain. And the reason for that is it's a dangerous and risky business. You know, you have to go looking for oil in difficult, challenging geological places. Often the politics are complicated. So investors require a high rate of return for the risk that is being taken. But the point is, there is a huge amount of risk there and a lot of capital that has to be deployed to get the oil out. And the other thing to say is, over the last 120 years, for as long as we've had a major global oil industry, the cost has gone up over time. Fossil fuels are inherently inflationary, is the point I'm making, that over time you develop the cheapest resources first and then you move further and further up the cost curve. With renewable energy, it's exactly the opposite. Renewable energy is inherently deflationary. Okay, so for a start, there is no upstream in renewable energy. And in fact, it's almost a misnomer to call it energy. It's really better to think about it as infrastructure. And the cost of that infrastructure has been plummeting like a stone over the last decade. And in solar in particular, it will continue to drop sharply going forward. So the whole risk-reward ratio that you're looking at with renewables is very different from the risk-reward ratio that we've all grown up with in our minds, and that we've all learned the discipline of economics on this basis, that energy is inflationary. So I think psychologically, for the companies that are engaged, that we have to get the companies to move. Ultimately, for us as investors, what's important is to get the companies to move. We want to invest in companies that have got a sustainable future. Both Divya and Rolfine mentioned the fact that this is something that's already happening. I mean, I'm a utility specialist, and I've spent 20 years covering the European utility sector. We've seen 50% of the market capitalization of the utility industry lost in Europe, which the utility industry is traditionally viewed as a low-risk sector. Why did that loss happen? It was mainly because the established incumbent utility players were too slow to realize what the implications of a system that was depending more and more on renewable energy was, on a deflationary source of energy. And one of the problems was they couldn't change their mindset to invest in a different form of energy that had a different risk-reward profile. And I see exactly the same thing today with oil executives when I speak to oil executives. Why don't you invest more in renewables? Well, we'd like to, but why would we invest in renewables where we can make 6 to 8% return when I can invest in an upstream project and make 15 to 20%? And my answer to that question is because in the future you won't be able to make 15 to 20% because you're now up against, for the first time ever, a deflationary source of energy that with electric vehicles, building on what was said on the last panel, will for the first time be able to compete with 50% of the market demand for oil. So, as Rolfine said, this is a complex situation. There are lots of moving parts and lots of variables, but I think that's the big picture that everybody needs to have in mind. And sometimes it's harder for people who've been in a given industry for 30 years, have made their career on the back of assumptions that have held good for 30 years, to all of a sudden be able to change their mindset and say, oh gosh, you know, we've now got a source of competition here that seems to have a very different profile. Should I be invest? The point is, if they don't invest there, somebody else will. But the other psychological barrier is of course it's difficult for established companies to invest in other energy sources that are going to undermine their own business model. So that there is that in play as well. Let me talk about the two other factors that I think are, just very briefly, helping to drive this as well. And as I say, I think all of this works in a feedback loop. More regulatory pressure. For us as investors, we're coming under more regulatory pressure. The European Union is in the process of developing a green taxonomy. I think it was finally agreed at the end of last week. This is going to have very serious consequences or implications for us as an investment industry in Europe. So that it's no longer a choice of being able to ignore this. You have to take this seriously into account. And to Rolfine's point about the performance of ESG and how it can help generate alpha, we are now also at BNP Paribas Asset Management in the process of integrating ESG into all of our portfolios. And I think that's a different challenge from having dedicated SRI funds, which has been the industry norm for so long. Because in a way, SRI funds are self-selecting. People who invest in SRI from the beginning have a different set of criteria from people who invest in mainstream funds, want a good performance, but our proposition now is to say, well, we think ESG integration will help improve your performance. That's kind of the whole point. But on the metrics point, which I think is important, and the data providers, this is another, I think, obstacle to acceleration, actually, because some of the data, as Rolfine said, is either still too early, still too raw, or simply patchy. We don't have it covering all companies, especially in emerging markets. So this is an area we really need to see more work on. But I think the regulatory pressure will help drive this. I'm very encouraged by Christine Lagarde's statements about bringing climate change into the mandate of the European Central Bank. Remains to be seen exactly how that is done, but I think that's a very powerful signal as well. And finally, you know, the other thing helping to drive this is what our clients are telling us. You know, increasingly we have asset owners who want to place their money with us and insist upon a minimum level of ESG, but some of them are very demanding. We're in the process of responding to a client request, and one of the key asks in that request is, show us how you will measure the temperature implied by our portfolio and how you will reduce it over time. It comes back to the data issue, because I think there is a real, but you can see the emotional appeal of that. That's a simple thing that people say, I want you to tell me how much global warming effectively is implied by my portfolio. And this will help, again, to repeat what was already said. You can't You can't manage what you can't measure. So being asked to measure this is the first step to be able to deal with it. But I think overall there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic here. And I think the final point, which we haven't really touched on yet, but the changing generational attitudes here is absolutely key as well. I mean, I think I arrived in Madrid late last night, but I was looking at some of the images of the 500,000 people walking along the Paseo de la Castellana, and just quite incredible what has happened in the last year, this wake-up call that we've had from the world's youth. And I think this too will only now accelerate.
Thank you, Mark. Coming back to Remco, and you were pointing to the issue just now of maybe not investing in fossil fuels, but does it mean that we say we are not investing, but maybe somebody else is, or maybe one part is doing something good within our company, we shouldn't look at the rest? So, and you mentioned before this issue of Paris compatible. So maybe we heard that we have made progress, but I think there is a switch already, and getting to the point of psychological switch or change. What do you see is our next frontier?
Yeah, no, thanks, Helen. And I mean, just to set the context for that and responding to some of the other points, I think there's plenty of reason for optimism, and cost is central, and what we see in mobility, I mean, just the previous session is quite telling about that. But also, I think there's also still, sadly, reason for pessimism, and that has something to do with psychology. It has also something to do with, of course, the coalitions, the rather unsavory coalitions that you see between vested economic interests and political powers in some of the countries around the world. I cannot mention them being UNEP, but it's some of the resource-intensive countries around the world that are inhibiting geopolitical progress here. So, and that leads to a situation at the moment, and so perhaps this has changed, but some of the latest, indications I had were along the following lines. If you ask the actuaries what they believe is the probability now for 1.5 degree limiting of global warming by 2100, I think the figure is somewhere around 1%. If you ask them for 2 degrees, it's 5%, and the rest is, up the curve. And so, and this brings me back to your point, and your finishing question, Divya, which was, well, if you're an institutional investor and you're up against those probabilities and you want to be prudent from a risk management perspective, how do you marry that with perhaps the more visionary side of your organization and your more societally responsible side of your organization, when you say, well, there is probabilities, but there's also a real threat to civilization here, and I want to play a role in avoiding that. How do you square the two? And I think part of the answer is, well, you need to obviously be, as an institutional investor, as a bank, as a company, you need to be on top of what a 4-degree world would look like for you, and you need to be managing that. At the same time, climate leadership, especially from a UN perspective, when it comes to non-state actors, is one where the non-state actor says, despite all of what my actuaries are telling me, my preferred future is one of 1.5. And again, I'm willing to make my portfolios consistent with that, portfolio-wide, across sectors. I mean, obviously, some sectors are more important than others. And that's the route that we are now opting to choose as UNEP with our partners. We've established 2 platforms now of financial institutions saying just that, saying we commit that our portfolios will be consistent with 1.5 by 2050. That's we have one coalition of institutional investors. It has 16 institutional investors so far with 4 trillion in assets under management. It includes many of the big brands in Europe, AXA and Aviva. It includes from the US, our only US fund CalPERS, taking a very strong leadership role there, and also the second largest pension fund from Canada. So, and that is what gives me hope, that it's the CEOs of those entities that obviously want to remain responsive to their fiduciary duties and very prudent, but at the same time realize the unprecedented challenge of climate change to society, and are willing to take a bold, leading stance on that. And yeah, we have 16 institutional investors, net zero portfolios by 2050, and very much those are the asset owners, and very much we're hoping that those will make your lives at the asset manager level a lot easier to respond to.
So if I can follow up on that, and since you're part of that net zero coalition, did you have everything figured out from the beginning? I mean, I'm going off the script, but I'm sure that it's important to know that sometimes we learn things by doing. What can you tell us about that experience?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we were present at Paris. I've been working on climate and investment for nearly 15 years, thinking about how do we merge these two things so that we avoid the 3 degrees or even truly 2 degrees and get to 1.5 degrees situation. And so when we thought about the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, it took a lot of consideration of, okay, nearly $400 billion, 70% funded, 7% target rate of return, which is hard enough to achieve in this environment with all of the other things that we're trying to accomplish. And so what we understood is actually there are things that we have started doing that hopefully this commitment will help us to invest more resources in. And so one of those things is engaging companies. I gave an example from a fixed income manager where we actually have been putting a lot more of our weight is with listed equity companies. In the lead up to Paris, my first job at CalPERS was to do a footprint of our public equity portfolio, which is just over half of our assets invested globally in 10,000 companies. And what we discovered is about half the carbon footprint of that portfolio comes from fewer than 100 companies, and that sure enough, looking across the world at our peers, other institutional investors based in other countries, they had a very similar list of the top, what we're now calling systemically important carbon emitters. So these are companies that if they don't reduce their emissions in line with 1.5 degrees, it makes the global task of reaching 1.5 degrees exceedingly difficult. And so what we did is actually brought this idea to the UNPRI, to Ceres, to all sorts of regional investor networks, and formed Climate Action 100+. And I go into this long discussion of Climate Action 100+ because it's key to our commitment of being able to deliver on a net zero by 2050 portfolio. The idea is that asset owners actually use, and asset managers, use their voice as share owners to have a productive dialogue with companies so that companies set a 1.5 degree aligned target, disclose the information that we want on their exposure to physical and transition risks, and solidify that commitment through the right governance mechanisms. There are 3 goals of Climate Action 100+. And when we launched it in December 2017, we had this, at that time, modest goal that, okay, if we get to 5 trillion in signatories, we can consider this as a good start, and we'll start building support for the initiative. But actually, at launch, we had $28 trillion worth of signatories, and since then, we've added 6 trillion more. So what the thing that says to us is, and it's really global, there are signatories in Asia, in every continent, really. What that says to us is that there was latent demand for collaborating internationally, and that this was a specific and coherent enough request of companies that investors could get on board with it. And so I think we will see more such initiatives of global scale and scope that it'll help us to get to net zero across our total fund by 2050. The other major thing to mention is advocacy. Carbon pricing is so important. Go ahead, Ruthie.
Yeah, no, I'm just in the interest of time. We are also members of Climate Action 100+, and we are the only asset manager globally that votes 100% in favor of climate resolutions when they come to annual shareholder meetings. But that's not the point I was actually going to make. I think one thing that has been missing from this discussion, and also a point that is really important to Latin America in particular, is the just transition. And we at DWS have been an impact investor as well for over 20 years. We have a large microfinance practice and have extended microfinance loans of over $2 billion over that 20-plus year period to predominantly women in emerging economies to create financial inclusion. And of that $2 billion, about $160 million was actually extended in microfinance loans to Latin American countries. When I talk about the just transition, I think it is really important in this discussion around climate change. And unfortunately, I am in agreement with Greta Thunberg. I'm not optimistic that we're going to get there. I'm actually really I'm a born optimist, but I'm actually really pessimistic. I think we've done too little, too late, and we are potentially on a pretty calamitous situation for the world. And looking at Latin America and looking at the poorest of the poor, it's always the poorest of the poor who are going to pay the highest price. And amongst those poorest of the poor are a lot of women who take care of their families, who take care of their children, who will be impacted the most by the impact of climate change. When we looked at the picture that you showed around Latin America, I mean, just think about the cities that will be underwater, the livelihoods of poor people that will be impacted. So when we talk about climate change, it is also really important as asset owners and as asset managers to really think about the human condition and to think about the human impact that climate change ultimately will have. So DWS is a signatory to the just transition. And I think it's really important in everything that we've been discussing on this panel that we don't lose sight of that human element. And I encourage all of you to sign up to a just transition, because what we're seeing in the streets of Chile at the moment, what we're seeing on the streets of other countries in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia, is social unrest. Now, that social unrest has a lot of different reasons. But if you are right with your slide, and we will have 17 million climate refugees just in Latin America, and I think that's a very conservative number, think about what people will do ultimately for their families. And so it's really important when we talk about climate change and when we talk as asset owners and asset managers that we also think about addressing the human element through the just transition. And I just want to make that point because I think that's the point that has been missing on the panel up till now.
Thank you, Rufin. I think that the social aspect of the implications of transitioning it's really very, very important. And each time we are seeing either projects within IDB Invest, we are looking at the social component as a key element in our investments. And it's good to know that it's taking root not only in multilateral development banks, but also in asset owners and asset managers. I think they're giving me signals that maybe we have time for a question or one. So let's take a question.
Hello, thank you. I'm Ana Barreira, Director of the International Institute for Law and the Environment, and it has been very interesting, and I think my point of view is that there is very good theory, but what is happening in the practice? I was reading that recently has been released a report by a German organization called Urbegal, and they have announced that in the period of 2017 and 2019, in the last 2 years, already has been invested and supported with $745 billion the construction of new coal power plants. And I'm raising this because, for example, they provide data on BlackRock, and they hold 17 million bonds and shares in companies planning to build more new coal power plants. And recently there has been released the report by UNEP, which is called the Production Gap Report. And they are announcing that if we continue with the same path of using fossil fuels and we continue as it is planned, this is not going to be any change at all. So it's really very interesting to hear what it is planned to be done, but what I'm really surprised is that we have the information already, and the Paris Agreement is from 2015, but there has been no many changes still. So we are already, there are possibilities to change the path, but nobody is doing much from the financial sector. So what are your opinion? Do you think that we are going to see quickly changes, because we need urgent changes?
Yeah, we certainly do. Well, I can't speak for the entire financial sector because it's a very disparate group of institutions globally. I think much of what your question touches on is what Remco said earlier about institutional and lobbying blockages in established networks of political power. A lot of that coal, obviously most of that coal is being built in the developing world, Southeast Asia in particular, China and Southeast Asia. And I'm very clear that the economics are now no longer in favor of coal, but what you have, of course, is well-established industry groups that are often very close to governing parties. So that is an intractable issue. What we can do on the financial side, clearly, is we can refuse to finance these kinds of things. At BNP Paribas Asset Management, we are about to implement in 3 weeks' time, from the 1st of January, a total exclusion policy on coal investments. And we have a public commitment to align all of our portfolios with the Paris Agreement by 2025. So we will, after we've excluded coal, we will be looking at other carbon-intensive industries, and we will be tracking progress using tools such as the Transition Pathway Initiative to track how closely different companies are aligning their business models with the Paris Agreement, and we'll also be, as also being members of the Climate Action 100+, we'll be lobbying there. I mean, when I said I was more optimistic, I meant, imagine if we hadn't seen the reduction in renewable energy power the costs that we've seen. So I think we need. It's very important, I think, to give people hope at the same time, because relentless gloom or relentless reality, I suppose, it can be too much. But I think the phrase of Gramsci comes to mind: pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. And we have to believe that we can do this. And I think everybody, all of us, civil society, the investment industry, the financial industry, governments, have to keep the pressure on.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for ending in that such a high note. I think we could continue talking about this for a long time. There are many, many aspects of it, but we just gave you a little flavor of ESG integration into investments and climate. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for coming here.
Thank you. It's me being the bad guy again, but you do like your breaks, and we're going to be back in this room for session 5 and straight into the closing session. So you've got 25 minutes till 4 o'clock, and again, listen for the bell, please. Thank you.